Hi, thanks for joining us for the Family Plot, Gardening in the Mid-South. I'm Chris Cooper. Today, we're going to talk about growing succulents. Also, Mr. D is going to talk about the different ways insecticides kill bugs. That's just ahead on the Family Plot, Gardening in the Mid-South.
Production funding for the Family Plot, Gardening in the Mid-South is provided by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the Family Plot. I'm Chris Cooper. Joining me today is Dale Skaggs. Dale is the Director of Horticulture at the Dixon Gardens, and Mr. D is here today. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
All right, Dale, let's talk about succulents. So what do we mean when we say succulents?
Well, succulent plants are typically thought of as, well, I like to call them fat, lazy plants. Okay.
Okay.
Because their tissues are sort of swollen and very fleshy, and that's how you identify them as succulent plants. A lot of people think succulents are cacti, and it's true. All cacti are succulents, but not all succulents are cacti.
All right.
They're sort of defined by these little spiny cushions that they have where the spines emerge. You know, because some succulents have spines, but they're not coming from that spiny cushion, and so that's the distinguishing characteristic. I happen to like the succulents that don't have spines because you know, when you're a gardener, you hate dealing with them.
Right, exactly.
But, it's pretty amazing. These plants have evolved these defense mechanisms and traits for survival because they store water in really watertight conditions. So everything wants to eat them. Everything wants to, from herbivory to just surviving, just the heat and everything else. They're pretty amazing how they've adapted to survive.
What kills more succulents than anything else?
Probably overwatering. Overwatering. We have a succulent exhibition right now at the Dixon, and one of the things that we have are some living rocks, some lithops. Right. I don't know if you've ever heard of lithops. They're from South Africa, and they look like stones. They use mimicry as their defense mechanism. Wow. We have a plant that's a euphorbia that looks like sticks. So the leaves are modified so that it looks like dead sticks.
Wow.
And the lithops look like living rocks is what they call them. They look like rocks. So nothing eats them because they just they're disguised, I guess, in hiding. So anyway, they're from South Africa. But I was going to tell you, I have killed lithops more times than... You never water them. That's the key. If you ever water them, they're just gone. So occasionally you see them at box stores and stuff. They'll have these living stones, and you can. They have a pretty hefty price tag, but but I think they're real slow to grow and really difficult. So
they don't have to be watered pretty much not at all, or just.
They grow in South Africa in conditions that are really arid and inhospitable. So it's really dry west-facing conditions. So. But anyway, we have, if you think about it, there's all these different mechanisms. You know, some plants actually separate, there's sort of a day-night separation in their photosynthetic process where, you know, they're splitting CO2 to build, basic photosynthesis that you learn in elementary school. But CAM plants, as they're called, which is long-term is crassulacean acid metabolism, but CAM is what you need to know. CAM plants, they actually open their stomates, the little pores under the leaves at night so they can take in the CO2 at night. They hold it in, and then when the sun's shining during the day, they do photosynthesis. That way, if they were to open those pores, when it's so hot outside, all the water would just instantly desiccate and go out. So anyway,
but especially here,
But these succulents are really popular. You go to... I was at a local grocery store, and I walk in, and they have this succulent display. Everybody just loves them because they're easy to care for, you know. Because of these adaptive advantages, they're used. You know, a lot of these are hardy outdoors, and they're being used as sort of the backbones and the workhorses of everything from green roofs. You know, there's a couple of green roofs in Memphis, but they hadn't really caught on. More urban areas like Chicago and New York and stuff, these green roofs are a really big deal. I think there's acres and acres of green roofs in Chicago, and there's tax incentives for businesses that incorporate this into their thing. So anyway,
we need somebody to introduce those practices here, though, to get more people to get involved with it.
I think I think Tresvant Manor here has a green roof, and there's a doctor's office out in Bartlett, I think, that has a green roof. but certainly the technology's there.
Oh, sure it is.
But just like, all the questions you get, everything's so localized.
Yes.
And, in Memphis it works one way, and somewhere else it might not work the same way. So really a lot of research needs to be done on which plants work best. We've put in a little green roof at the Dixon, which was kind of fun. It's just a small space, but it's kind of neat to see. And then living walls. Do you know about these living walls? Sort of vertical gardening. They're real easy to build. We just sort of use recycled materials that repurposed. Susie Askew had kept these big long troughs that were used for something horticulturally. I don't know if it was a hydroponic thing or something, but big galvanized troughs. And we made a media that was real lightweight and filled these troughs with succulents. And so now they're sort of louvers, and it's a vertical garden at the Dixon. It's really neat.
Tell me this. What type of media do you need for succulents? I mean, what?
Well, fast draining, sharp media,
okay.
yeah, as you would suspect. Fast draining, you don't want anything that holds a lot of moisture.
Right.
And they're not big nutrient hogs, so they don't need a lot of high nutrients. So if you had potting soil that you wanted to use for succulents, I would just mix in some sand or a little gravel or something. There used to be a product made across the river that's this clay that they heat up real hot and expand it. You ever hear of Arcolite? Arcolite.
I think so.
It used to be sold over in Arkansas. Now I think the nearest supplier's down in Alabama, but I'm not sure what the product was originally used for, but it's like clay that's been expanded. It has a lot of pore space. But Paul Little.
I do.
He's
Of
a big.
course.
He's anybody's
seeder
talking
guy.
succulents
Yeah.
in Memphis. You got to know Paul.
You're right.
But Paul said he used to drive over to Arkansas and get it. And the first time he went over there in his little Toyota pickup truck, he said by the time he made it back to his nursery, his truck was empty because the stuff flew out like
Oh,
popcorn.
wow. Okay. So it's like
So it's
that.
real lightweight,
Light.
yeah,
it's
real
light.
lightweight. So
bentonite.
kind of like, it may be heated bentonite. I'm not sure exactly the product, but that works really well for green roofs because it's lightweight.
Okay.
And different considerations when you're going vertical or covering a rooftop,
Okay. Let me ask you about sedums for a second, because folks grow a lot of sedums. Again, what type of care do you need for them? Because we actually got a couple of calls at the office about people growing sedums, but the sedums were rotting for some reason or the other. So,
Yeah,
what have you seen with those?
First of all, you need to buy good quality plants from a good nursery that knows what they're doing. I have seen plants where slugs or snails get in there and can cause some damage. I've seen sow bugs, but I think they're actually eating some of the root. They may be secondary. What are your thoughts on?
They can.
They can?
Sow bugs and pill bugs can actually eat foliage. Yeah.
So I've
they
seen
eat a
that.
lot of that, yeah.
But
Organic material.
in general, you put them in, you water them in initially when you plant them to settle the soil and get everything done, and then they're really, really low maintenance.
Okay.
I mean,
That's what I thought.
cut the water down to a third of what you would normally do. I would say something like that. So I imagine overwatering is probably the best way to kill them if you're trying to get rid of them. So.
I imagine you got to have good drainage. But yeah, we've gotten that question a lot here lately, so just wanted to run that past you.
But they're beautiful. A lot of different
They are.
colors.
They are.
And there's a lot of, from small to large. There's a lot of sedums, a lot of succulents.
All right,
They're
well,
fun.
Dale, look, we appreciate that, and we can tell that you like talking about succulents too. So thanks for the information. Side dress is our next term, and of course we hear that all the time. Vegetable gardening.
Yeah. And that's a term to describe a type of fertilization.
Okay.
You know how you do that. We can broadcast, just get out there and just throw it every which way. That's called broadcast. And then we have a side dress, and there's other terms as well for other types, but we're going to talk about side dress. And that's usually in vegetable gardening. And you do that at a certain stage of growth when the plant is needing another big boost of fertilizer, and particularly nitrogen, to help them keep growing through the growing season. And to side dress, you just open a trench right beside the row, away from where the seeds are, but close. You don't want to burn the roots. And you just pull a trench and then just put your fertilizer there. Hence, side dress. Yeah, right. And some of the other crops that we side dress are the vining crops, vegetable vining crops like cucumbers, some of the squash that we have that vine, watermelons, cantaloupes, and we usually do that when they just begin to what we call run, when they start vining.
Right. All right, Mr. D, let's talk about pesticide mode of action. Very important, especially when we're talking about dealing with those pests that are out there.
Insecticides, insect mode of actions, and a little bit of fungicides. There are important to understand that there are different modes of action of these different products. And my first introduction to insect resistance was 1978, 79, when I was doing some work looking at a new product called insecticidal ear tags on cattle to try to prevent, to kill horn flies and face flies and things like that in cattle. And we learned very quickly that the ear tags were impregnated with a new, relatively new class of product called a synthetic pyrethrin or pyrethroid, which is and it worked real well for a year or two, and then we started noticing that it didn't do as good a job. And I can remember that some of the folks were denying that there was such a thing as insect resistance, and then after a very short while they had to admit there is. And I also, as an extension agent, I can remember recommending Sevin to kill fleas, and I remember that the dosage went up, and after a while the dosage was like 10 times what it used to be, and that's because the fleas were becoming resistant to carbaryl, which is not as common. A carbamate type of insecticide is not as common for resistance to develop, but that does happen. Some of the classes of insecticides or resistance happens quicker than others, but it's I can give you a list of some of the different modes of action that are out there. There's over 20.
Well, is it because these insects are reproducing so quickly and there's so many generations? Is that sort of the key to why this resistance happens so quickly?
That and you know, if only if you kill 98% of a population, you think, well, that's pretty good. But that 2% reproduces
pretty quick.
And probably most of their offspring are also resistant, and then you can see how over a short period of time you can have all sorts of problems. And many of these insects have multiple generations per year, and so that can really create a problem. But you know, acetylcholinesterase inhibitor is one. It inhibits causes basically a nerve gas. It's a nerve gas that kills insects. And actually, these insecticides were developed from nerve gases that were developed back in the 30s and 40s or 20s and 30s for other uses. You know, back then. But you know, they're acetylcholine receptor antagonists. They're nicotine acetylcholine receptor agonist.
They're neonicotinoids we're hearing about now. Would that be that mode of action?
Right.
That's what that is. It targets the central nervous system. That's what it does.
There are insect growth regulators that inhibit chitin synthesis, and there are
so that like keeps them young or something.
Keeps them young. When they're too young to reproduce, you can't reproduce, you know. And so it may not kill you, but it keeps you from reproducing, which is important.
That's pretty neat stuff.
Molting disruptors. There are electron transport inhibitors. There's a lot of different products out there, and you know, the take-home point from this is, don't continue to use the same insecticide all the time. I know when I was in the cattle business, we would, for years and years and years, cattle producers have used a back rub. The cows can go under and it rubs an insecticide on their back and it kills the critters. But very, very quickly I learned to use one type of product this year. Next year I completely switch to another. You know, I might use a organophosphate this year and then a pyrethrin next year.
Rotate.
And you know, rotate your classes to prevent resistance. It's resistance management. You're trying to prevent creating a super.
So you just shift totally your mode of action is what you're doing, right?
That's right. Okay. You can do that. There are products out there that you'll notice on the shelf that have two different products in them, and they have two different modes of action in them. You know, kind of be careful using those both out at the same time, because the critter that survives that is resistant to two modes of action. But fortunately, we got over 20. You know, we've got a lot.
It's a lot to choose from.
So I don't think we're going to have a super bug.
I hope not.
Anytime soon.
Oh, no. Now, what about fungicides? Let's talk a little bit about
Fungicides, the
that.
same thing. We found it, and that was probably the last organism that I've seen that's developed a resistance. But even it's been out there for a while. I remember even back in the 80s, benlate. We were using a real common Benamil, a real common fungicide, and it was not starting not to work as well as it used to, and so they've switched the classes. But there are strobilurins, which is several of the real common heritage, Cygnus
is one,
campus
yeah.
are examples of strobilurins, which we have seen some fungal diseases develop resistance to in the agricultural community. Frog eye leaf spot in soybeans is an example. But so you can add another class of triazole with that, and in the agricultural community, you usually don't completely switch to another because some of these fungicides have a lot of strength on several diseases. Some of them have strength on other diseases, and if you completely stop, you control this disease and you'll have another disease that'll wipe you out. So in the agricultural community, when the fungal resistance is encountered, most of the time the farmers will have to use a product that's got multiple modes of action.
Wow.
But in your backyard for black spot control in roses, you can go with Daconil, but there are several things. Chlorthalonil is where's
propiconazole is another one.
And that's a strobilurin.
Yeah.
But Daconil is not a strobilurin. Where's Daconil? Chlorthalonil. It's a chloronitrile. So it's a totally different. It's same thing with blight on tomatoes. I know Mancozeb and chlorthalonil are two fungicides. They're totally different classes. Mancozeb is diethane 4 junction pentathlon or Mancozeb, and they're in the M3 class, dithiocarbamates and relatives. And then Captan is another product that stands alone. It's in the M4 phthalimide group, but keep in mind if it has strobilurins, if it has strobin on the end of its active ingredient, pyraclostrobin, azoxystrobin, or whatever, it's a strobi. And just keep in mind, don't stick with the same fungicide all the time. Mix it up if you can. And that's why I read off all of those when I list a bunch of products that will control the disease.
All right, and that's your take-home message. So we appreciate that, Mr. D.
When you clean your garden spot of all the old plant debris and the soil gets fairly clear, well, you go back out there in a little while, a day or two, or even a week or two, and you've got thousands of tiny little weed seedlings, like all of these right in here. Thousands and thousands. So the easy way to do the weed control, like to take care of those, is just to rake your rake across the soil lightly, and it pulls those little dudes up when they're really small. This only works when they're really small. And then you can do that periodically through the winter, and what you're doing is you're forcing all these weed seeds to come up and then destroying them, so you're gonna have less weed seed the next spring that's gonna come up in your soil. And to show you the difference this makes, this course was raked, this was not.
All right, here's our Q&A session, and Dale, you jump in there with us. All right. Here's our first letter. Okay. People are still writing letters. We have a picture that actually came with the letter. It says, "Dear Chris, I planted these blackberries in September of last year. The vines have really grown. Should I let the canes grow or should I prune them back?" And this is Mr. Vaughn in Lewisburg, Tennessee.
That's a venison question.
Yeah, this is Mr. D.
Well,
Blackberries.
Blackberries are interesting critters. Okay, they planted them this past
Planted them
spring,
September of last year.
September of last year. So all of the canes produced this year were prima canes,
Right.
called prima canes, and they're strictly
1 year.
vegetative. And so I'm sure he didn't have a lot of blackberries this year. Now, the canes that come off the prima canes are flora canes or the second year. So canes are biennial. The roots are perennial on blackberries. And so the canes live 2 years. First year the prima canes, second year the floor canes, and the fruit are produced on the floor canes. Yes, you can prune them back.
Yes.
Probably a good idea to prune them back. Most of the fruit are produced back toward the base of where the floor cane comes out anyway. So I would prune the floor canes back to 18, 20 inches and get them back. And if you have erect types, erect blackberries, probably bring them down to 38 to 40 inches in height, and you won't adversely affect your fruit production at all.
All right, Bun, there you have it from Mr. D himself. It will not affect your production. All right, here's our next letter. This is pretty neat, Dale.
Yeah.
This is writing letters. Mr. Chris Cooper, my crepe myrtle is at least 50 years old and very large. It had a lot of dead limbs in it this spring. The winter must have been hard on it. It still bloomed this year on new limbs. How and when should I prune my crepe myrtle? This is Miss Mary in Blatterville, Arkansas. So Dale, what say you about that? So when is the best time to prune your crepe myrtle, and how would you go about doing that?
Well, if you're, the nice thing about crepe myrtles is they flower on new wood.
Flower on new
You can
wood.
cut them all the way back to the ground
Yeah.
and you still get flowers. They're really tough. You know, there's a whole movement. Jason Reeves is part of it. And
Yeah.
Stop the
Stop
chop.
the chop.
You
Yeah.
know, and you know, crepe myrtles do have wonderful forms and shapes to
do.
them. So I like to prune a plant. If you plant a plant in the right place, you should be able to prune it to its natural form. And I think prune a crepe myrtle anytime your shears are sharp would be a good analogy. But in the winter, you can see the structure better.
Sure.
But horticulturally, I don't think there is a wrong time to prune a crepe myrtle.
Okay.
You know, I like to cut back anything that's bigger than, say, the size of a number 2 pencil. Like when you were a kid, you know, those big fat pencils that you used to write with. I don't even think they do it anymore. You use standard pencils.
I don't know.
They have mechanical pencils.
Yeah, that's mechanical. So anyway.
Yeah, so-
Or digital, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So anyway, I hope that answered that.
Yeah, that answered the question. And I'll tell you something else. Anything that's crossed, anything that's diseased,
Absolutely.
you know, I would get rid of those.
Dead, crossed, diseased, always, yeah.
You know, get those out of there, you know, back to the nearest, you know, large branch or limb, or back to the trunk itself.
A lot of people like to limb them up too.
Yeah,
Take the
that's
suckers off the bottom, limb them up so you can see that beautiful trunk.
Mm-hmm.
But we're having all the issues with the scale here. So
Yeah,
we'll
yeah.
see yet to see what that's going to do. I
Yeah,
think.
we're going to find out a lot more about crepe myrtles here coming up real soon. All right, so I hope that answers your question. All right, here's our next letter. All right,
All 3 letters.
all 3 letters. And look at that. College
You're
paper.
like Santa
College
Claus.
paper. Yeah, how about that? We have several Nandina bushes. The tallest is 6 feet and the shortest is about 4.5 feet. How far back can we prune the Nandina bushes, and when is the best time to do so? And this is Bill in Rossville, Tennessee. Mr. Bill, we have Dale. I think Dale can help us out with this one. Pruning
Yeah.
back those Nandina bushes.
Do you want to?
No, have at it.
Okay.
Have at it.
Nandina bushes tend to, by their natural habit, is sort of very long and leggy, and then they have this horizontal branching at the top. The best way to prune a Nandina is to go all the way down to the base and take out some of the canes.
Wow, all the way down to the base.
All the way down to the base.
Okay.
You don't really hack them in the back, then they get real bushy at the top. You want to keep that structure where they're very vertical and then horizontal. That's kind of how large Nandinas grow. I would say late winter would be the
Late
best
winter?
time
Okay.
best time to prune them. You know, a lot of people are concerned if you cut something back hard now that it won't have enough time to harden off good before it freezes, and so that makes sense. But I like to reach in and sort of thin those canes as well. So reaching in, going down low is the best way to prune a Nandina.
Wow, down to the base.
Sounds like blueberries, right?
Yeah,
Pretty much.
in the back. All right, so I hope that answers your question. All right, so here's our next viewer email. My tomatoes would not ripen this summer. How about that? Now that we have had some cooler weather, they are putting out lush green leaves and tons of clusters that are just staying green. This is the first time this has happened. I grow them in pots every year. Has this been a bad year for tomatoes? And this is Miss Elizabeth in Pleasant View. I thought this has been a pretty good year for tomatoes.
It's been pretty tough.
Is it? I think pollination when it's real hot, isn't that a problem?
Well, you know, it
ideal-
will abort the buds when
Will-
it's real
when
hot.
it's real hot, yeah.
Right, but once we get to the temperatures that we have now, which are cooler,
Yeah.
then they're going to start reproducing like crazy. But I thought the tomato season's been pretty good. Early on, we had a lot of rain.
Yeah, that was a big problem.
Early on.
Yeah.
But then, we kind of got, a little straight there with the weather. And everybody I know, most of the farmers that are producing tomatoes was like, hey, it's been good.
We're
No
good with
problem.
this.
The optimum temperature for tomatoes to ripen is between 66 and 78 degrees. That's the optimum temperature. If the temperature is above 85 degrees, the tomato is not able to produce the pigments that will let it get ripe. The lycopene, there's 2 or 3 different pigments that will cause it to change color. So if you have sustained temperatures above 85 degrees, and we did.
Oh, we did.
Night temperatures above 85.
I mean, sustained temperatures above 85 degrees. And we did even in my area, up in Lauderdale and Dyer County. We had tomatoes that didn't get ripe.
Wow.
They just sat there on the plant and they stayed green and they didn't get ripe. But in the middle of the summer, yes, it really and up until just a few weeks ago, tomatoes have really struggled.
Wow.
In my area.
In your area, okay. They've been fine here from what I understand from the farmers.
I know Chris spent some time in Corvallis, Oregon, and
Yeah,
I
I
did
did.
too. And it was the exception when you had a ripe tomato. That's right. The year of the green tomato was pretty common.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it wasn't hot enough.
That's right. All right, well, Dale, Mr. D, we're out of time. Thanks for being here.
Good deal.
All right.
Great. Thanks for having us. Fun.
Remember, we love to hear from you. Send us an email or letter. The email address is familyplot@wkno.org, and the mailing address is Family Plot, 7151 Cherry Farms Road, Cordova, Tennessee 38016. Or you can go online to familyplotgarden.com. That's all we have time for today. Thanks for watching. I'm Chris Cooper. Be sure to join us next time for the Family Plot, Gardening in the Mid-South. Be safe.